Seattle Freight Transport Advisory Board currently. If I would take 10 minutes to go through his biography. It's really quite something. What I should really get across to you is that through his level of education and experience in dealing with all levels of government in bureaucratic layers, and also with grassroots organizations or corporations, that plethora of experience is coming to us today in this presentation. He's worked on high-speed rail projects in Texas. He has a background in environmental sciences, a Master's of Science degree from the University of Washington, a PhD in several areas. His bio, as are all of the other speakers' bios, are on our website. So I encourage you to look at that closely. I don't want to take up too much more time. In regards to the link between Dr. Hussein's presentation and Hal's presentation, when Dr. Hussein was talking about water, we're looking at fresh water. There is a capability for us that we have not explored, and that is why we actually catch 11% of the rainwater that would normally go into the ocean, and have that in a reservoir available to us. That is another example of using a higher way of thinking, science and technology, to be able to provide for the water. Now, how do you get the water from the reservoir to the rest of the continent? Of course, everything is flowing up, and we got to get it down. That's where energy comes in, but that's also where infrastructure and rail come in on a massive level, and that's why I'm going to introduce Hal Cooper now. So thank you very much, Hal, for coming to speak with us.
It's good to be here. Dr. Hussein is talking about the future. I'm going to talk about the present. What I'm proposing today is basically making use of our existing infrastructure primarily on the Columbia River in British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon with regards to the potential for shipping water from northern Canada to California. All of you have probably seen recently that there's been a whole series of problems with droughts, most recently last week in the southeast. Now, we're not proposing to send any water there, but we're certainly talking about water going to California, potentially to Texas, and also in the Rocky Mountain states and to Arizona on the Colorado River. Can I have the first slide, please? There you go. Interestingly enough, going back to the early 1960s, there was a project proposal that was put together by the Ralph Parsons Company of Pasadena, California, to actually build a system to pump water from northern Canada in both the Yukon River and Mackenzie River basins to the southwestern United States. And it was a very extensive system that was proposed. And it would be able to take water from Canada and ship it to the south. And in effect, Canada would be sawing the water. And I think the outgrowth of this plan is, what would Canada's benefit be? Well, Alberta's budget would probably go into surplus, selling water to, it's like oil and gas. And we wouldn't have all the pipeline battles we've been having, at least not as many. Unfortunately, we have the environmental groups in Seattle, Vancouver, etc., who are trying to stop all development, thanks to our friends in London, and they're just keeping their agenda hidden from the rest of us. I think that probably puts it about as tactfully as one can. I understand that because I need to see these things. It's hard to do. In Mexico, yeah, a gentleman by the name of Manuel Frias proposed water pipelines from the areas in southern Mexico where there's lots of rain to the northern part of Mexico where there isn't very much rain at all. And he made those proposals back at least 10 years ago. There's a large aquifer in the central states on the Great Plains going from South Dakota down to Texas. It's called the Ogallala Aquifer. And it is recharged in Nebraska, but down in the southern part, it's been depleted because there isn't much water going in and there's a whole lot of water going out. And slowly but surely the farming is going away. The article in the National Geographic in June very well showed this. You have the Columbia River, you have the Missouri River, you have the Colorado River, and even the Rio Grande that can all benefit from this program. Next slide. The key is the Rocky Mountain Trench, which actually goes from the Yukon Territory down to Montana. And it goes through the eastern part of British Columbia on the west slope of the Rocky Mountains. It has a large lake, Williston Lake, in northeastern British Columbia, which right now has 2 hydroelectric dams on it. It has the WAC Bennett Dam and the Peace Canyon. And there is a proposal to build a 3rd dam called Site C. And the generating capacity right now is about 3,600 megawatts, and Site C would increase it to about 4,700 megawatts. There are approximately 3,500 megawatts on parts of the lower Columbia River in Canada, but actually it is more than that. And so the total generating capacity on the Columbia River right now with the hydroelectric power is somewhere between 35 and 37,000 megawatts. And about 8,000 of that in total is in Canada. And there's a natural water course in the Columbia River, but you have to get the water there. And while we could take water out of the Columbia River, there has been some people who claim there actually is enough surplus right now. My guess is that probably wouldn't sell very well politically, so let's do something that will sell, which is take it from the Mackenzie River, where there's a very large flow. In fact, it's 40% larger than the Columbia River, and it's all going out into the Arctic Ocean. And interestingly enough, none other than the environmental groups have said there's too much water going into the Arctic Ocean. And it is unnecessarily diluting the salinity of the Arctic Ocean, and that potentially this would create enough of an imbalance with the water in the Atlantic Ocean that we might actually see a stop of the Gulf Stream. Well, let's turn their argument around against them and say let's put some water, take water out from the Mackenzie River, which is between 7 and 10% of the total water flow into the Arctic Ocean, the largest, of course, being the Lena River in Russia. Now, in this case, you have the Rocky Mountain Trench. It starts way up in the Yukon Territory in what is called the Tintina Trench, where there's a great number of minerals. It's up near Carmacks in the Yukon Territory. And it goes all the way down to Flathead Lake near Hayfork, Montana. And there's a large a lake there, which could be a reservoir. And there's Williston Dam there already, which is something like 280 miles long and 5 miles wide and, I don't know, 300 or 400 feet deep. And right now the Peace River flows out of that, and that's where the WAC Bennett and the Peace Canyon Dam are, and where the Site C Dam would be. And water could be pumped out from the Mackenzie River and the Liard tributaries and put in Williston Lake. And then there would never be a loss of water to Canada. And Canada could sell electricity and water. And interestingly enough, when we get this system into the United States, it actually works out that they would get probably between 80 and 90% of the power back. So there really isn't all that much of a loss. Now, next slide. This is the proposal in a more easily understood fashion. Water's coming from the Mackenzie River to the south of Fort Norman. You can take water from the upper Yukon River, except that there isn't a lot of flow near the source. That's at Teslin Lake, right on the border between the Yukon Territory and British Columbia. Also, when you get downstream on the Yukon River, you start seeing elevated levels of uranium and mercury in the water, so you probably wouldn't want too much of it. Now, the water would come down. There would be actually a canal or pipelines in the Rocky Mountain Trench. Water would go from Williston Lake into Kinbasket Lake, which is behind Mica Dam, that's right near Revelstoke, and then it goes down into Revelstoke, and then you've got Keenly Side Dam. And then those are the three dams. And then that water would go with the Columbia River, and it would go all the way down to the Dalles, Oregon. And there are 14 dams on the Columbia River from the mouth up to the source. Now, there also is the Kinbasket Lake is a three-armed lake, and actually it can be extended to Columbia Lake and then Kootenai Lake, and that water can go down to Montana to Flathead Lake, and then some of it would go through a pipe system through the Rocky Mountains to Salmon, Idaho, and then into the Snake River system, and some of it would go to the Colorado River from All-American Dam near Pocatello, Idaho, and the rest of it would go into the Missouri River system that would also be used to recharge the aquifer, or go into the lower Missouri River and go to Texas. And then we would be able to solve quite a number of problems that we would have between 30 and 40 million acre feet of water a year diverted. The flow in the Mackenzie River is somewhere between 230 and 250 million acre feet a year, and the flow in the Columbia River is between 170 and 195 million acre feet at the mouth. At the point it's being withdrawn, near the Dalles, Oregon, that flow is about 155 million acre feet a year. Next slide, please. This is the system in Canada, going from the Mackenzie River and potentially from the upper Yukon River Basin. But I would think that the majority of the volume would come from the Mackenzie River, because it actually starts at Great Slave Lake, the Athabasca, the Liard, and the Peace Rivers all flow into that, and there is a potential for a very large amount of water to go in, and at the moment it flows out basically unused into the Arctic. And it comes down through the Rocky Mountain Trench, the very large reservoir at Williston Lake, and then going into Kinbasket Lake, and then water going into the Columbia River, and the other going down to Columbia Lake and Kootenai Lake and Flathead Lake in Montana, and that goes to either the Colorado River or the Missouri River basins. Next slide. This is the system in the United States. It's a little bit different than what NWAPA proposed. And the main body would go on the Columbia River and be diverted from the Dalles, Oregon through a series of 6 reservoirs to Goose Lake on the California-Oregon border, which is at an elevation of almost 5,000 feet. The water at the Dalles, Oregon is at about 220 feet, so all that water would have to be pumped up, and that would be somewhere between 10 and 15 million acre feet a year of water, which would be somewhere between 5 and 10% of the water flowing in the Columbia River at that point. A small amount of the water would go into the Klamath River Basin, so we don't have to go through this idiotic exercise of taking out all 5 of those dams that are being proposed. Now, there's a problem for the Yurok and Hoopa Indians downstream near the mouth of the Klamath River in far northwestern California, south of Crescent City, where they actually have had a great deal of their salmon run water taken away. Well, this would restore all of it. And then they could put the salmon runs right back to what they were many years ago. There's a small amount of water from the Trinity River that actually goes into Whiskeytown Lake, northwest of Redding, California, and then it goes into the Sacramento River. Now, the water from Goose Lake goes, actually, at one time, go back before 1900, Goose Lake, which is about 40 miles long and 10 miles wide and maybe 20 feet deep, would be greatly deepened, and that would be the main reservoir going into California. And that water would go down on what's called the Pitt River, which is actually one of the 3 tributaries of the Sacramento River, and it would flow into Lake Shasta. That would be approximately 10 million acre feet of water a year. A portion of the rest would go down through near Susanville, and there would be reservoirs at Lake Almanor and Eagle Lake, and it would flow into the main reservoir at behind Oroville Dam, which is actually where the hydroelectric dam is that provides the power to pump the water in the present California aqueduct from the San Joaquin Sacramento Delta all the way down to Southern California. So we would be making use of the existing system, but expanding it. You could put all the water in the Pit River and it would go to the Shasta Dam, but frankly, I think you'd overload the dam. So we need to have two things. And you have the possibility you could pump water down to Las Vegas. Lake Mead is seriously down as far as its level. And it's at the point now where they had to build a new pipe to take water from the bottom of the reservoir because where it was in the middle, it was drying up. And that would replenish the lower Colorado River. Because everybody has a valid claim to the water on the Colorado River Basin. The problem is there isn't enough water. And right now, Arizona has, as you can see, from going from Parker Dam all the way down to Nogales, Arizona, there's what's called the Central Arizona Project, which brings water to Phoenix and Tucson, and a small amount is pumped to Nogales. And then the rest of it goes down the Colorado River, and there would be enough additional flow that we could actually restore the mouth of the Colorado River to having some water in it, because right now it doesn't. There's a small amount that goes to the Mexicali Valley in Mexico. Now, I also proposed going from Flathead Lake down through Idaho to all the American Lake Reservoir near Pocatello, and then going into far southwestern Wyoming into the Green River Basin all the way down the Colorado River, and a small amount of that could be diverted into the Rio Grande River, which would go into central New Mexico and Texas. And then the rest of it would go through the Missouri River. There already are 7 reservoirs on the Missouri River, going from Fort Peck all the way down to Gavin's Dam at the South Dakota-Nebraska border, and those would be used as storage reservoirs. Water would have to be pumped uphill to the near Alliance, Nebraska, and then it would go all the way down to Texas on what's basically level land. And all that is where the Eulal Aquifer is, which badly needs to be recharged. And you could also take water from the Missouri, which flows into the Mississippi in St. Louis, and then it flows down to Lake Providence, Louisiana, and you would have a reservoir there and a pumping station to bring water to Texas. But the problem is if you come from the Mississippi as compared to from the north, from the Missouri, you have to pump it uphill rather than let it go downhill. And California's advantage over Texas has always been that water could flow downhill from the mountains to where it's needed. Whereas in Texas, you'd have to pump it all uphill if it came from the east. And the old Texas Water Plan of 1968 proposed to do at least some of that. But unfortunately, it was shot down in part because it was going to take 8,000 megawatts of power to pump the water out. That was about 10 million acre feet a year. Going to California with 15 million acre feet a year, it would take something like 6,000 megawatts, of which probably 5,000 megawatts could be recovered once you go into California on the Pit River and build several new dams. And believe it or not, the Pit River Indian Tribe and Pacific Gas and Electric Company already have an agreement that's been in place for at least 30 years to develop the hydroelectric resources. There could be at least 3 dams put on that river, and it would generate up to 4,000 megawatts of power. So, some of the hidden things we find out about. Next slide. Here's what the elevation looks like for the system to take water to California, going from Columbia Lake, actually that should be Kinbasket Lake where Mica Dam is, Air Lake, and then the very long Roosevelt Lake behind Grand Coulee Dam, which is the largest dam in the entire system of almost 7,000 megawatts. It has a 130-mile long reservoir that actually goes to the Canadian border. And then there's a series of dams downstream, and it would finally pump water from the Dalles Dam at the Dalles, Oregon, and then it would be pumped uphill all the way to Goose Lake on the California-Oregon border, and then it would flow back down to the delta near Antioch, California, where the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers join. Next slide. This is a map showing the Columbia River Basin, which actually includes parts of Nevada, Utah, Idaho, a little bit of Wyoming, part of western Montana, most of the state of Idaho, a good part of the state of Oregon, and a good part of the state of Washington, and a good part of the southeast part of British Columbia. It does not go directly into Alberta, but if water is taken from the Peace River, it certainly would go from Alberta. Next slide. This is another picture which shows where the dams are and who owns them. On the Snake
and the Columbia River. Now the environmentalists are trying to get the 4 dams on the lower Snake River taken out because they claim the water is too hot and it hurts the salmon and they want them taken out. We don't need to do that. What we need to do is have a better system. In fact, I was at a public hearing Thursday night in Seattle where there was a fisherman who told me that, well, if you had a source of cold water and you were able to separate that out for the rest, you can collect all the salmon and they would flow down. Now the large salmon going back up to spawn are not the problem. It's the little ones going down. And if you had a pipe where you had cold water, then you would never get above the 16 degrees C temperature that would cause salmon to have fatalities because of heat. So that's something we would need to look at as far as how we would make it work, because that's always been the objection. And of course the environmentalists feel, well, we shouldn't have anything. Take them all out. Well, this is curing the disease by killing the patient. Next slide. This is the flow of the Columbia River, the maximum, the average, and the minimum that has ever been observed. And the flow at Astoria is about, as I said, about 195,000 acre feet a year, and at the Dalles it's about 155,000, and up at Grand Coulee Dam it's at 100 million acre feet per year. And coming out of Columbia Lake, it's probably 35 million acre feet a year. A few numbers. Next slide. This is another system that actually shows the water and then also the rail. And I think we're going to need to incorporate that as part of the West Coast Corridor. But we need to get the water system built first, and we can take water from the Columbia River at the Dalles and pump it down, put some of it into the Klamath Basin, the upper Klamath Lake, and also going into the Harney and Mallard Lake Basin in southeastern Oregon, and turn the desert into productive agricultural land. All it needs is water, and then that would go into the Snake River and ultimately go back into the Columbia River. Next slide. And this is another view of what the water system would look like. The water coming out of the Dalles Dam would go in parallel to the Deschutes River, and then go into the Billy Chinook Reservoir, Prineville, Silver Lake, Summer Lake, Lake Abaird, and finally Goose Lake. And then separately you'd have water going into the upper Klamath Lake and into the Klamath River Basin, and then water would go down the Pitt River, and some of it could go also into the Feather River from Eagle Lake to Lake Almanor and behind Oroville Dam. And if you put 15 million acre feet of water in the Pitt River, and the present flow in the upper Sacramento below the dam is 5 million, you can see we're going to have a problem with the dam, so we probably ought to space that out. And we have to raise the dam. In fact, several years ago there was a study done of what could we do to Lake Shasta. They're proposing to raise the height of the dam without increasing the amount of water. And you know what? It caused more problems than it solved. So you got to put water in there to make it work. California cannot solve its water problems with the water in California, no matter how you slice it. And unfortunately, with their all-conservation strategy, that's exactly what they're trying to do. And all they're doing is draining their groundwater in the San Joaquin Valley aquifers. Next slide. This is what the Obama policy is doing, and predecessors too. The Pitt River, as you can see, is that water coming from Goose Lake in the northeast down to the east end of Lake Shasta, and then there's the McLeod and the Sacramento River, and then separately you have water going to the Klamath River, and water comes in from the Trinity River, but they do divert some of it to go in from Whiskeytown Lake out of Trinity Lake, and that goes into the Sacramento, and most of that particular water goes to the rice farmers in the Sacramento River, or Sacramento Valley, near Williams and, I forget the name of the other place. When you drive along Interstate 5 through the Sacramento Valley, you see where the pounds are for the rice. Maxwell, excuse me, Gary. Remember that. Go ahead. Next slide. Now this is the water system in California, and I've added what comes in from the outside. The San Joaquin Valley probably uses 70% of the water. But there's a problem. The drought has caused some real difficulties, and if they don't put enough water in the delta, it isn't just to protect the fish, it's to prevent the salinity coming in from the ocean. And if they don't put that water in, they're going to poison all the farmland in the delta. So they decided to take the political expedient approach of saying that they needed to protect the smelt and the salmon going upstream into the Sacramento River, when in fact what they were really doing was preventing the salinity. And in the meantime, all those farm workers in the San Joaquin Valley got put out of work. And if you want to go see what it looks like, just go down there now in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley, where they don't have any water for the farms right at this particular time. And I've been working in Bakersfield and got to see it myself. And then, of course, Southern California gets its allocation of water. It gets something like, it's a 2.5 million acre feet a year in the California aqueduct. The capacity of the system is 5 million, and there's a parallel Delta Mendota Canal, which was actually built in the 1930s, and Southern California gets its water. But then you're dealing with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, which is a very ubiquitous and powerful agency, and it gets what it wants, because there's 15 million people live in the Los Angeles Basin. They all vote, so, or at least most of them, and that skews the politics. California has its own very interesting politics. Next slide. Governor Brown proposed taking some of the water from the Sacramento River just south of Sacramento at Cortland and putting 2 underground pipes, 24 feet in diameter each, to take 6 million acre feet of water and bring it down to Banks Lake just near Tracy, and then putting that into the San Joaquin, or the Delta Mendota Canal and the California Aqueduct. That's a nice idea, but the problem is if you don't have enough water, that has produced a huge amount of opposition. If you had more water, you wouldn't have a problem at all. Next slide. And here's another view of that pipeline, south of Sacramento, northwest of Stockton, and there's a ship canal going to Sacramento and another one to Stockton that smaller ships can go through. Next slide. Now, how many of you know that California has more oil than any other state in the Union? They do. It's called the Monterey Shale. There it is. But with the state's politics, probably not being all that different from British Columbia. I mean, you know, the shape of California, the shape of British Columbia seem to have a similarity, and so do their politics. Very different than Alberta and Texas, or at least it was in the past. But there's a great deal of oil there, but it can't be developed if you don't have a regulatory and political structure that facilitates it. But that would be another place to use water as well. And Dr. Hussain is talking about desalination. I can't think of a better way to desalinate water and a better place to do it in the southern San Joaquin Valley, where you got that water coming from their oil production. Get the salt out and then use the water. Believe it or not, at the Kern River oil field on northeast Bakersfield, the water coming out of the wells is good enough that they sell it for irrigation water. And that field has been producing oil since 1899. It peaked at about 130,000 barrels a day in the 1950s. It's still producing 85,000 barrels a day of oil, and a fairly large amount of water, which is all sold for irrigation purposes. Next slide. This is out of the previous LaRouche report with the California-Oregon water system diversion from the Nuwapa plant. And I think that was one of the things that got me very interested in this several years ago when I read that, and I realized that, you know, this is something that really needed to be done, and it was being ignored by the present political and economic guideposts that have been forced on us by our good British oligarchy friends. Next slide. Now, I've also done some work on the rail side. I'm not emphasizing it, but I do want to tell you. The recent election that has happened, while it brought Trump in, probably a defeat for the financial interests that are back in the British oligarchy. It may have a very interesting effect for the West Coast. All three states went heavily for Hillary Clinton. All of them are Democratic. All of them have high technology industries. And they want to maintain their economic independence. What's the best way to do that? You got to connect all the financial centers together. That's Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Tijuana. And that would probably be the best reason for building this. Now, we have a housing problem here in Vancouver. We're getting pretty close to that in Seattle, and San Francisco's ahead of both of us. Now, to give you an example, if you want to buy a house in Palo Alto or in San Jose, south of San Francisco, a 3-bedroom house will cost you over $2 million. It's less than $500,000 in Santa Rosa at the same distance north of San Francisco. And what's the difference? The lack of suitable transportation. So what we need to do is build a high-speed or higher-speed rail up the north coast where there was partially a rail at one time and be able to settle people where we can spread the housing out and maybe reduce the cost somewhat. And the same concept's going to apply in the Vancouver area and in Seattle and Portland as well. So this would give us an impetus to build our rail system up so people can find a way to commute to work, because they're going to have to live at longer and longer distances away. And we need to locate more of the business centers outside of the main cities because it's getting too costly to operate. And believe it or not, the Sierra Club, our good friends at the Sierra Club who fought all this, they had to move their office early this year from San Francisco to Oakland. The reason was they couldn't afford the rents in San Francisco anymore. How many of you knew that? Couldn't happen to a nicer group, right? Next slide. And here's our Silk Road concept. The LaRouche organization has been the leader philosophically in this for many years. They have obtained strong support from the Chinese and the Russians and others. And what they're proposing is what's needed for this country and for this world. Next slide. Here's a more global perspective looking at the Arctic, the quote-unquote Silk Road. There's already a lot of rail been built. Believe it or not, there are 2 high-speed lines proposed between Moscow and Beijing now. One of them goes through Kazakhstan, and the other one goes along the existing Trans-Siberian Railway, and that would be something very much needed. Next slide. This is the Bering Strait Tunnel, which would be about 65 miles long, 3 to 4 tracks. And we would need to build infrastructure in Alaska, in Chukotka, that's on the Russian side. And there's large coal and oil in the northwest. There's lots of minerals and oil in Chukotka, and there are also large gold as well. And to the west in the Tsar Republic, lots of diamonds. And there's even a proposal now that the Russians are looking at coming down to Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky at the lower end of the Kamchatka Peninsula, because that's where there are quite a lot of people live. It's about 4,000 people. Next slide.
That's it.
We're done. Well, we need to get going on this.
All right.